Good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to be here this afternoon. Last year, I completed a 5-year term as the executive director of UNICEF, which is an organization of the United Nations with offices in over 150 countries around the world, with about 11,000 employees around the world helping children with the issues primarily of health, of education, and of protection of children. So during my tenure there, I traveled to over 70 countries. And what I saw was absolutely amazing. I saw poverty I would have never imagined. I saw suffering that I didn't believe that anyone could endure. And yet, through all of this, I saw hope amid the disaster and the suffering. I saw children who were dying of AIDS because their mothers had passed it along to them in the womb. I saw other children who were struggling to survive on their own because their parents had died of AIDS. I saw children in hospitals, some suffering from diseases like malaria, something that could have been avoided with a simple $10 bed net for protection against mosquitoes. I saw children suffering from malnutrition, often because they had diarrheal disease linked to not having a clean water drinking source. And I was so pleased to hear Lisa speak today about some of the solutions that may be coming down the pike to help those children. There are around 70 million children in the world who are not in primary school. A few years ago, I met this woman in Africa, and she had 9 children. And she said to me, one of the most difficult decisions I ever made was which one of my children to send to school, because she could only afford to send one of them. And it's so often the girls that are left behind. It's the girls who, if you have to make a choice among or between your children in sending them to school, the girls are held back to fetch the water, to fetch the firewood, to help with the food. And then there are the countless children who need greater protection. Children who are working in the factories, who are working in the fields, children who are sexually exploited, children who are trafficked for child labor, for prostitution. It is one of the worst forms of child protection issues that I encountered. And then there are countries where girls are subject to harmful practices like female genital cutting and early marriage. A few years ago, I met this young girl who was 9 years old, who at 9 years old had been forced into marriage by her family to a man 3 times her age. She decided she wanted a divorce. She'd learned about this from a related family member, that if you went to the courthouse and went to a judge, you could get a divorce. And indeed, she got one. And she's written a book about it. But it's just not that unusual for young girls in countries like Yemen or Saudi Arabia or Niger or parts of India to be married, to be forced into marriage at the age of 9, 10, 11, or 12 to a man 2 or 3 or even 4 times her age. And children are the ones who suffer most from conflict and war that is so prevalent in so many countries. In northern Uganda, I met children who had been abducted from school or their communities or even from their homes. They were forced to fight in the rebel armies at the ages of even as young as 7 or 8 years old. And some of the young girls were not only required to fight as child soldiers, but they were made to be the sex slaves of the generals. In places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, rape continues to be used as a weapon of war. I met countless women in the Democratic Republic of Congo who have suffered the most horrendous abuse. Many raped multiple times, but there's one girl in particular who I will never forget. I met her when I was there. She was about 12 years old, but she looked young. She looked to only be about 9 or 10. And I started talking to her. She really didn't want to talk about the horrible crimes that had been committed to her, against her. She'd been raped by 4 soldiers. So I engaged her in conversation about school and about other things. And then I asked her, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And her answer spoke volumes. She said, "I want to be a nun." The situation that's going on now in Japan is a solemn reminder of what disaster situations do to families, and particularly what they do to children. I had the opportunity at UNICEF to visit many places in the aftermath of disaster. In Pakistan, after the earthquake in 2005 up in the Himalayas, and last year, within weeks, just a couple of weeks after the earthquake, I was in Haiti. It was so devastating. It looked similar to when I visited Gaza after the last bombings there. Everything was flattened. The countless children who'd lost so much, they lost family members, they lost parents. But one of the hardest things in Haiti was visiting the hospitals and seeing the children that had lost their arms and or their legs. Now, I don't mean to paint a picture of only despair, because in fact, tremendous progress has been made around the world in addressing the issues of children's health, of their education and their protection. More children are in school than ever before. More children are protected. And more children, through the work of UNICEF and others, have gotten immunizations against deadly childhood diseases. In 1960, around 20 million children died every year of largely preventable causes. Today, that number is down to around 8 million, and that's during a time when the population has more than doubled. But despite this progress, so much more remains to be done. And I want to talk a little bit today about what really works in making sustainable progress in poverty alleviation, particularly focused on children. It really is important, and I think these are some of the lessons learned, that you address the underlying causes of poverty, that people have the opportunity for economic empowerment. It is simply not sufficient to provide aid for the effects of poverty. People need to be given the opportunity to get out of poverty. So what are some of the lessons I think that we have learned over the years? One is something that we've talked a lot about during this conference, and that is the importance of empowering women and girls. Now, we're talking about 50% of the population, 50% of the population, and yet only about 2% of development assistance is spent on women and girls. Women and girls are the ones who fetch the water, they care for the children, they bear the children, they produce and prepare the food, they bear the brunt of sexual violence, and they face discrimination in society, in their communities, and in their countries. There's a UN Food and Agriculture report that just came out this month. And it says that global food harvests could rise by between 2.5% and 4% if women had stronger rights. Now, that's a significant increase in a time when food prices are higher and supplies are tightening. Now, why is it so important that women be given greater opportunity? Because, as we heard yesterday, women are about 70% of the smallholder farmers in the developing world. They also produce about 80% of the output, but only make about 10% of the income. And yet, in many parts of the world, women can't own land, they can't inherit land. And so, if a husband dies in a war, or of a disease like AIDS or some other disease, the woman may lose her home, her livelihood, or even her children. Now, why do I say her children? Because in some cultures, the family takes everything of the deceased son or brother, even the children, leaving the woman homeless, penniless, and without her family. In many places, as we know, women don't have any access to credit, and so they have little opportunity to expand their farms or their businesses. And we heard this morning about Muhammad Yunus, the Nobel Prize winner, and the Grameen Bank that he started, and which has started so many other microcredit organizations. But it really gives women an opportunity for economic security for their families. And the results are dramatic. Children are healthier, they're better nourished, they're in school. And so they have a brighter future, which then begins to break that intergenerational cycle of poverty. Now, we heard some of the statistics yesterday on the importance of women and girls, but let me just reiterate a few. A woman in the developing world is likely to spend about 80 to 90% of her income on her family, while a man is likely to spend 30, maybe 40%. Girls with 7 years of education marry about 4 years later and have 2.2 fewer children. When 10% more girls go to school in a country, the GDP of that country goes up by about 3%. More education for girls means lower malnutrition rates and lower HIV infection rates. 1 year of additional primary education for a girl increases her later wages by an estimated 15%, but an additional year of secondary education increases that girl's lifetime earnings up to 25, can raise her eventual wages up to 25%. So investing in women and girls makes good economic sense. It makes good sense for society. Second, approaches to addressing poverty need to be integrated. So one of the things that I think has to be looked at is too many government agencies and organizations are focused on a single intervention. But just for example, if you or your organization decide to build a school in a community, an impoverished community, but nobody thinks about providing teachers, and the children haven't received health care, so they're not healthy, and they don't have good nutrition, you're unlikely to get the result that you want, and that is an educated workforce. And so it's important that you not have a school full of sick and hungry children because they're not likely to learn. And I want to make a point about early childhood nutrition as long as we're talking about well-fed children, because one of the lessons also learned is that malnourished children, particularly under the age of 2, are likely to have a lifetime consequence of decreased cognitive ability. And what does that mean? It impacts the child for his or her lifetime, affecting the ability to learn in school and later earn as an adult. Understanding the culture of communities and countries is also so important. I was in Sierra Leone a few years ago. It's a country that went through years of conflict, and it had a lot of child mortality was among the highest rates in the world. And the breastfeeding rates were very low. which has an impact on the health of the child and impact on child mortality. I said, why? These women can't possibly afford formula. What are they feeding their children? And they said, rice water. Rice water. Again, understanding the culture so that you can then work with the women and change it in the communities. There has to be a greater recognition of the interconnection of issues, because to alleviate poverty over the long term, you need to address all of the issues and the interconnectedness of them. And finally, no one can solve the issues of global poverty alone. Government can't do it alone, civil society and the private sector. And I think social enterprises, which we've heard so much about at this conference, are having a tremendous impact in changing the paradigm about how to make sustainable change and development in communities, not just aid, but economic opportunity. There is an article that was released just this year in January in Harvard Business Review by Michael Porter called Creating Shared Value, that I think makes the case very dramatically for the importance of the private sector engaging more directly in this. The article underscores that the private sector must take a lead in bringing business and society back together, that good social practices are good for business. So let me give you a few examples of this, and I'm running out of time, but one was a operation that was doing greenhouse agriculture that I saw in Ethiopia. What this company did was they invested in healthcare and education. I said, why are you putting all this money into the community? They said, because we want to be here for the long term. We want to invest in the future of this community so we will have a workforce. The same kind of thing when HIV/AIDS was really rampant throughout Southern Africa. Businesses found that they should better invest in treatment and in care of those people, because retraining new people as people died was much more expensive. It was a win-win for the community, a win-win for the business. More and more companies that source agricultural products in the developing world are providing extension to farmers, and that helps them have a better opportunity to get better productivity, better income, and better alleviate environmental consequences. So all of these are good examples of how the private sector can build into their business for a win-win for society, a win-win for the business. There must be a coming together of all of the partners to make a difference. It is only then that the children and their children will have the opportunity for a better future. I'm often asked, isn't it depressing to see so many children suffering throughout the world? And yes, it is. It can be very hard sometimes. But there's also so much hope. You cannot look into the face of a child and not see that hope and not see the anticipation of the lives yet to be fully lived. Thank you very much.